if I can be known for one thing, it's like preventing the graveyard of like great products because of like bad business. 10 times more open source and like 10 times more happy engineers just because like everyone's just much more massively profitable.
Today's episode is with Angelo from Railway. What I really love about Angelo is he has this real strong business mindset combined with technical skills, and he just writes like incredible articles about very technical things in sales, like Slack automations and stuff. And in today's episode, we talk about how they've been able to like massively increase response rates from their customers, have enterprises just sign up and start paying with their Brex account. This conversation was very, very fun for me, and I think it'll be fun for you as well.
You know, I joined Railway as a support engineer because I was a very active and avid user of the product, and I was the closest thing to like a non-technical hire because I was interacting with customers all the time. And then we start getting emails from people being like, oh crap, can you talk about Railway to my boss? Can you start, you know, like we're getting questions about, not about the product, but how Railway is as a company. And I think that's kind of when I realized, all right, we're going to have to deal with sales eventually. And that was a beginning of a very long and painful journey of like learning a bunch of different mannerisms and things of being able to like just land a product into a company. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. Yeah, there's a few threads that I'm like right now kind of going through my head. One is, whenever you join a startup because there's a strong vision about how things should be done, right? Railway's point of view in the world is that infrastructure should work and it should be beautiful, right? So that was the original vision that got me on the board. However, you know, many people who join a startup live in this really weird, dreamy fantasy world of the future. And then you start talking to customers and leads, and they're living in the very dreadful reality. And you have to do a lot of work to get them out of their usual day-to-day cynicism, which is fair, by the way, to start buying into the way you do things. So, yeah.
And I guess there's also like some of it is like when you're trying to build the product and the vision, you've got like, I think when I interviewed Jay before, like saying this is like the hardest problem, that you guys are working on the hardest technical problem. So I imagine there was also like just like a lot of figuring things out as well, like at the beginning.
Oh, absolutely. And the worst part is like, I mean, I think Jake would disagree, but I think like our customers don't care, you know, like, oh, like I don't, you know, oh, so what, you're dealing with, you know, like weird object storage limitations. I just want the thing to work. Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think the number one thing that when my initial assumptions whenever I started to moving towards sales was that, you know, I would just be going in front of customers, giving them invoices, signing kind of LOIs or signing these deals. And then the actual practice was, all right, I'd be going into these demos with these like really high aspirational kind of like, this is the, you know, canvas, and this, you know, you can deploy minutes and not days. But then when the actual pain points that our customers were experiencing were much more pragmatic and much more like, you know, heck, even emotional in some cases, like, will this tool that I implement at this company get me promoted? Right? Those were concerns that I even didn't consider at all whenever working with those accounts. And that was a whole different entirely skill set that I had to learn to be able to kind of navigate that. So meanwhile, and then again, you know, you should listen to the Jake episode if you can. You know, he's out here in that, you know, in the high-minded dream world and trying to make dreams reality. And you know, people are complaining to me about,
taking
you know,
out the
how do I
bodies.
make Terraform work? Yeah, right. Yeah. It's like, yeah. Customers ask for it, give me better Terraform. And he's like, we're not doing that, you know. So, you know, and then going back and forth with Jake, you know. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going on sidetrack. Like, do people literally say to you like, this will get me, I care about my promotion, or is it something that you kind of have to like?
No, it's something that you have to be really good at like teasing out of people. So I think like, you know, to kind of preface this. So I moved into, you know, revenue side at Railway, I would say probably 2 years into my journey. So for context, I've been at Railway now for 4 years and 3 months. And, you know, the latter half of that has been mostly focused on compliance and revenue stuff. And arguably the compliance stuff is the same side of the same coin, right? When it comes to revenue conversations. And the problem with like, I would say technical sales is that a lot of engineers are sometimes bad at indicating what they want, if that makes sense. So I'll use like a really hard example. So, we get an ask from a lot of customers about like infrastructure as code. It's like quite a big ask. And it makes sense because a lot of them have been trained through a variety of, I would say, existing material, either through their boss or through the Google SRE manual, that all changes like should be versioned within a file and then stored within Git, right? And there's a lot of benefits to this world that we live in, and arguably, it made the cloud revolution possible. However, right, what IAC kind of struggles with is like, how can I audit the whole chain of changes between an infrastructure organization and, let's say, like a product team, right? So like if I'm a product organization and I'm building a new product, I now have to interface with this like weird YAML-y API, and no shame to YAML, in order for me to like get my infrastructure provisioned, just so I can, deploy new product initiative number 2, right? And now I have to go speak this entire new language to this, separate team. So the infrastructure, like the way it looks like to the infrastructure organization when we talk to a railway, is like, give me better IAC. Can you make it so that these product teams can speak IAC? The product engineer absolutely does not care about that, right? They're just like, I have this GitHub repo. I need it to be live. Can you help me with handling the political process internally so I can actually get the resources that I need to actually go out there? So like, I'm already like 2 minutes into this explanation. If you take them at their face value, give IAC, but then if I peel the layers back, no, why do you want this? What's actually your upper level goal? What is your true intention? Then we're able to kind of peel back the layers of their intent, and then we're able to have a much more substantive conversation. Whereas really bad, and I don't want to like knock any SDR that you probably have experienced, right? But sometimes the SDR on the other side of the line is not an engineer, and they're not able to intuit these things. So they hear, I need IAC, and then they run to the engineering organization, be like, give me X feature. And then there's this like whole other internal battle between what sales thinks that they needs to be built for a company and what actually is your true product vision of your company, and then practicing that. And that's a whole, separate conversation.
Scaling Dev Tools is sponsored by WorkOS. At some point, you'll land a customer who needs enterprise features like audit trails, SSO, role-based access control. You could spend ages tearing your hair out building these things yourself, or you could use WorkOS. Let's hear from Utpal from Digger.dev.
I can speak for open source companies because I think that's where I have the most experience personally. If you're open source and you're doing enterprise first, the minute you think about monetization is when you should think about WorkOS. How it's designed is that you can start as early as day 0. But for us, it wasn't day 0. It was closer to when we first started monetizing because we didn't have a sign up at all. People could just anonymously use our tool. To be honest, if we do that again, I think we'd think about that on day 0, to be honest, because we should have done it on day 0, ideally. Anonymous usage should be permitted, but you should know who's using your tool. It should be opt-in, 100%. But it'd be great to have auth from day 0. So yeah, that's what I think.
Thanks, WorkOS. Back to the episode. Because I guess at some point, like even if you're actually like technical, if the salesperson's technical, it's like, I guess like the world that Railway's living in, like it gets very technical very fast. Like even if you hire like extremely technical salespeople, it's like, how do you kind of tie that up?
Yeah,
like,
so I think the best way to kind of describe it is through like a narrative, right? Between how Railway kind of, I would say, moved up market and rather swimmed up market, and then how I would say most companies, like if anyone else was listening to this and they're not Railway, right? How would they kind of like take this advice and apply it to their advice as they're scaling a company from seed to Series A and beyond? So like Railway is unabashedly a product-led growth company, right? We make it insanely easy for you to like type in dev.new into your, browser and like have at it, right? Yeah. And so like for us, the upmarket motion was basically a lot of engineers shadow ITing Railway to a company, and then us having to explain post facto to an organization, no, we're actually can be trusted within your network boundary. And those are like, I would say good, but very difficult conversation to have, especially when you're a company that is very prideful, and I mean this like a good way, about leverage within the organization. And what that means is that like, at most companies and, most sales organizations, the way a sales motion is kind of structured is I have like this pyramid of people, right? I have like SDR, from 1 through 8. It's kind of like a Kubernetes, like, little pod structure. And then like I have like, all these 8 SDRs assigned to like the eastern half of the United States, right? And like depending on if these like quote unquote like pods are healthy or not, I'm gonna cull them and like fire them, and I'm gonna replace them with like better infrastructure. Railway, we don't necessarily have that privilege, right? Because like a technical resource at Railway is like one, very hard to hire, and it's also very even harder to hire a technical resource that understands like how to interface with a company. So like for us, for example, I'll like highlight my colleague David Echo, who joined us from GitHub. David, when he works with our accounts, he's a highly technical resource. With that said, at a more traditional enterprise company, there would be like a forking of the code base, and they would customize that code base to kind of fit like a large bank or a large customer. And then that one large customer would provide like 90% of your revenue. At our very start of Railway, Jake was very firm that we would not go off and do like engineering side quests to secure revenue, right? We wanted to make it so that whenever we built features that moved up market, it needed to be extraordinarily painful. And when I say painful, like I'm probably underselling it. Like, it was never yelling internally, but there were times where I'm sitting across the proverbial desk between me and Jake being like, look, if we like, you are blocking 8 figures of revenue by you saying no to this. Why? Right. And he's just like, we just need to wait. We just need to make sure that we have a proper story so that when we do ship the thing, it's like an unabashed flood of revenue coming in. But that's a very different company that you're building, a very like linear like company versus let's say like like a ClickHouse style company, or like a Scylla, or like that type of dev tool, which to be fair is a perfectly valid go-to-market motion. But the caveat of that is that usually the sales organization and the engineering product organization are at complete total opposite ends of the table. That's a very long explanation, but that's like, I would say argue the 2 different types of sales organizations you kind of see at a DevTools company.
So it's kind of like how you solve this issue is either your way, which is basically sales have to fight tooth and nail and maybe don't get their way, basically.
The way we kind of look at it is that the sales organization in our case is, I would say, arguably subservient, right, to the product vision of the company, right?
Yeah, or like extension even. So.
Yeah, right. So like the way sales comes in is that like our job is to basically unblock the deal by dealing with, I would say, organizational hurdles between adopting Railway and then building whatever we need to overcome those organizational hurdles. But we are not necessarily in a situation where, we will like fork Railway and have like Railway private on-prem, I'm not saying that there's a world that will not happen, but I'm saying that like usually the biggest mistake that I kind of see is companies who try to move up market is that I would say they fork the product too early. And then what they do, what I would say the tent of suffering of like enterprise motions, where you have like a forked version of your product, like a cloud hosted version of the product, and then you have like a quote unquote open source or like core community version of that product. And then what ends up happening is there's like a consternation, which you've probably seen with the whole Redis changes, where it's like, oh cool, I've had this like pseudo free product distribution in a bunch of these organizations, and then a company gets a Series C or Series D, and the way they monetize is so different than how the product is distributed, then they just like piss off all of the core user base, right? And Redis walked that back, but there's like a bunch of tons of case studies you can kind of point to where the open source distribution model of a company just consistently is at odds with the way how a company monetizes. And we didn't want to be a company where we would like offer something for free or offer something that wouldn't provide proportional value, and then we would go try to charge for it, and then we would have a bunch of angry DMs saying, oh, you pulled the rug from under us. I would even go as far as to say that the one slightly dangerous thing from open source, this is probably going to get me flamed on Twitter, is that it sets the effective labor value to 0, right? And like you're kind of seeing this with like the Carpathy repo, and like I think like Mitchell Hashimoto has been pointing out about the Ghosty repos. There's a bunch of like really low effort PRs that are done on pieces of software that a maintainer has to go and like automatically filter. Now, Mitchell can do this because, he, I think, is like, post HasherCorp and whatnot. But imagine you're trying to build a profitable business, And imagine you're trying to like keep a community happy. Yes, they're offering value in terms of distribution, but it's very difficult for companies to defend the core value of a product and like charge, let's say like 5 to 6 to 7 figures for that product, when, you know, an engineer can kind of point to you and say, no, it's for free on this GitHub repo. I have a right to pay nothing for it. And that's the biggest tension that a lot of companies are facing.
Yeah, that's true. And then the opposite approach that you did explain, but just to sum it up, is that you would fork, like you would have versions almost for every different use case, and you just become like, it just sprawls out into this massive undertaking just to keep things going and hire tons of people.
Yeah, you know, I don't want to name specific company names, but you know, whenever a lot of dev tools companies are commercialization, I would say, of like profoundly groundbreaking research that gets commercialized. And, you know, I'm a little bit biased. You know, I have a meetup that we invite these researchers and they talk about their creations and they talk about how they, you know, like they don't talk about the businesses of it, but thing in the back of my mind is like, okay, you know, how would you commercialize this? And then they focus so much on the engineering that they don't think about the business. And then they're, you know, what is it? Seed, Series A, Series B, you know, early customers go by really quickly and easily. And then they get to Series C, and then, you know, it's very unfortunate they get fired and replaced with a professional CEO, right? And that's because, you know, the same way how there's like tech debt, there's like sales debt or like business debt that usually isn't at the forefront of these companies. That, you know, when you're answering to a board or when you're trying to like actually commercialize a company, you're going to get asked a lot of questions about, you know, what's your net dollar retention looking like? So yeah, I mean, you know, what you mentioned, the downside of focusing too much on product and not even thinking about your commercialization and how you think about your go-to-market is that, well, you know, if you don't think about it entirely and you have a really bad year, you know, your company's going to shut down, or worse, right? Since it's like a husk of a company, you get replaced with a professional CEO, and then the whole weird vision of why you even started doing this thing, you know, gets sold off by the wayside. And there's some things, like, I'm not saying not being CEO is a bad thing, right? Like, I think to different strokes, different folks. With that said, I would probably wager that if you started a company, you would probably want to imprint your vision on the world somehow. So like, why not do the thing that will help you imprint that vision on the world by, you know, maintaining control of your company, you know?
Yeah, because it's not just about the money.
Yeah. I'm of the belief that founders, I think, are the correct amount of lionization, actually, because it's really miserable for you know, for most of the period.
Yeah. So as in, you think that they should be looked up to because it is a pretty hard job.
This is such a bootlicker take coming from me. Yeah. But I think
do you want to send a message to Jake?
Yeah. Not even for Jake, but I think in general, like, look, I used to be a founder way back in the day, and you know, you yourself as well, right? It is so hard to make something and get it out there. It is even harder to get money for what you make, and then exceptionally harder to have a great business, right? So, you know, like, I feel like I do what I do because I'm still kind of like trying to get revenge for BlackBerry. Like, they made the BlackBerry playbook, which was the most perfect operating system of all time, and it was like, you know, just destroyed by Apple, right? For, you know, because the people up, you know, Canada couldn't figure out how to commercialize that thing. Right. But like, everything around me, right, has been destroyed because things were fundamentally bad businesses, despite they were like great products. Right.
Yeah.
And like, if I can be known for one thing, it's like preventing the graveyard of like great products because of like bad business. Right. Like, I'm my number one advocacy is like, if you can just think about how you sell something just for like 5 minutes a day. I'm not asking for much, right? We can live in a world where, like, you know, I agree, like 10 times more open source and like 10 times more happy engineers, just because like everyone's just much more massively profitable and we don't have to live in a world of like, I don't know, private equity slop. So, you know, that's kind of my view of the world, you know?
Yeah, I think it's a fair ask, Angelo. I think it is.
So yeah, you know, maybe I'm pro founder, you know, so what?
That's amazing. I want to get onto some automation stuff because I think there's some very practical things for people. But before that, you did we a very quick sidetrack onto this. There's a guy, Monzo, Monzo, not the bank in the UK, at MongoDB, um, who I know you're a big fan of. I don't know if he's still there, but like we had this whole like Twitter DMs thing about how he's really good at value extraction. And I feel like it's the kind of thing we could do a whole episode on, but maybe you could just give a quick headlines about like people that are very good at getting money out of dev tools.
Yeah. So I think for your listeners, right, the context was there was, I think, a tweet that was quite popular where it's like, I can't believe we use this. And it was a picture of the MongoDB logo. And I'm not going to, I think Mongo's good technology. I'm not going to go insult it. I think it's fine. But I think MongoDB is actually a really great example of technology that in some, and not my opinion, but in some people's eyes is subpar technology, right? But it was massively commercialized well because of this gentleman named John McMahon. And I think from my understanding right now, I think he's kind of pseudo-retired. He's like a 5-time chief revenue officer, just a board advisor of a lot of companies that we know of, Snowflake, ServiceNow, MongoDB, like the true undisputed GOAT of sales. And, he's just a very polished gentleman and has a really great knack for like navigating people. He's not necessarily technical, but he has usually done technical sales. Now, the thing is that like at some point, whenever you operate sales or sales organizations at like a really high level, at some point you don't necessarily really need to know, like you're mostly managing kind of organizational psychology. With that said, a lot of people who don't understand is that, MongoDB was commercialized because they had a really good understanding of what's called ICP. You probably hear this all the time in a bunch of startup advice, ideal customer profile. And, I don't want to recount really painful memories of anyone who currently works at MongoDB, but there was a meme way back in the day, right? MongoDB's web scale, and it was said tongue in cheek, rather ironically, because the way they got their benchmarks was by writing your data to dev null. So, how do you sell a database that had a reputation of, data inconsistency? Well, you find companies where they are moving on the leading edge of, say software development, and who I think were necessarily, Postgres and ORMs, right, was a much different time today. Like Prisma wasn't really in use in 2010, right? So, they sold primarily to enterprising web developers and game companies, video game companies, right? Because if I'm storing a bunch of metadata about, whatever Unreal or Unity is kind of spewing out, I didn't necessarily care too much about the schema, and the schema was changing quite a bit. And that was kind of like their first, I would say like 50 million, right, of revenue just by finding out really core customer preferences, despite, I would argue, very vociferous developers who, look, I'm quite cat-like, I look at things, I can't tell you why I hate it, right? But it's just kind of is, right? Selling to developers like one of the hardest customer segments you can sell into. Yeah. So the fact that like this man who is not a database guy at all is able to kind of suss out the different preferences between the whole, I would say, preferences of a different developer base, and is able to, make MongoDB into a, multi-billion-dollar company, again, deserves my respect. So, if whenever anyone posts MongoDB stuff, slander on the page, look, I'll put a picture of John McMahon up on a reply. Now you know why. And that's kind of the source of him. And he has a canon of books, I would actually argue, that I think anyone probably, even if you weren't in sales, probably should read.
Yeah. 26 billion market cap right now. I know it's down.
That's impressive.
Overall for over 5 years, but yeah, been on a tear recently.
IPOing anything, in this market, I'm pretty sure he's in a ski ridge loft somewhere. Well, maybe not now, but
You mentioned like not to spend the whole episode, but you said that he was able to like suss out and figure out all this. Like, do you have any inkling into what he did that might be a bit different to what other people do to figure out their ICPs?
Very wholeheartedly, I think most advice that startups will tell you, or rather like most VC firms will tell you about like finding your ICP, are not wrong out of malice, but mostly wrong because it's like the same way like reading the Google SRE handbook out of context would like cause you to implement a bunch of stuff that's like way above, right, like the standard of your engineer organization. Like it's not bad advice, it's just not contextually applied. What, so like to kind of tie it to like, I don't know, my own personal narrative, right? When Railway was kind of moving up market, and by the way, like, I was a product manager for 3 years before this, and a software engineer before then. It's not like I was like coming in cold without like, enterprise awareness. However, when Railway clearly had to start making significantly more money than we are today, and we were, I think, in a really good spot, so it can at least, I think we were good there. But we're kind of at the point where, and Jake talks about this, where we were burning like I think a crazy amount of money for every dollar we brought in. So if we did nothing, right, Railway would not exist today. We would just simply have ran out of runway. So I wasn't necessarily panicking, but I'm like, okay, we have to do something about this. And a lot of the kind of conventional advice about ICP is, all right, well, they have like this like Clayton Christensen kind of view of the ICP, where it's like, find the most, forward-thinking, forward-looking customer segment that's like willing to risk it all and use your technology, and those are your true believers. Well, guess what? Those people, and I don't mean to insult them, usually don't have money, right? They're very vocal, and if you listen to that segment, I think a little bit too much, they'll actually kind of take you off segment and away from the customers that you really do want to sell to. So what John McMahon talks about in his books is that he's really good at separating what he calls, and I think what now people have accepted as a proper term, champions and actual decision makers who are able to buy your software. So a lot of early startups, whenever they make something new, will confuse, like 50,000 users as like genuine market fit, right? But if those 50,000 users of like your hypothetical thing that you're building aren't necessarily like kind of charging or like have their credit card in hand and willing to pay for it, those are not the customers that you really should be building for. So, whenever, again, this book was, I think, written, in 2015, I might be wrong, right? But like the book assumes that you're kind of having this like, custom style software, custom style solution that you want to sell. I think POG companies can kind of modify it, I think, to whatever they would like to do. But what John really emphasizes within the book that we've been able to kind of apply successfully is just like, whenever we're on a call of any sort of demo, we're listening to every single objection that we can get. And we're just obsessive about the amount of feedback that we get. And usually from those objections, you can kind of figure out and suss out what someone is something willing to pay for versus like what causes someone to like, I don't know, browse your offerings or browse your product set to even have this conversation. For example, Railway, like I can say indisputably, companies ship faster on Railway than they do on any other cloud platform. That is like one of the advantages that you have why we would pick us versus like, using AWS, right? However, right, velocity is fine and all, but usually the types of workloads that require velocity usually are, I would say, newer products that require a lot of iteration and go to market. The workloads that usually are core to someone's business are not necessarily shipping, let's say, every single day. And there's a lot of DevOps practices out there that some organizations are like cutting releases like once every week, right? Because there is a fair paranoia around like the protectiveness of that software, right? So like, just because someone finds your core value proposition quite like enticing, if you ever have these like deep conversations with some customers and they're like saying, look, that's this little piece of software here is nice and all, and this is cool, but the thing I really care about is this like big, massive behemoth monolith that, we only check in code once every, Tuesday, right? And in those conversations and those discoveries, we later realized, yes, this person who got us in the door is important. We want to make sure that we serve them. That's our champion. But the real person that we really have to make happy is, VP of infra of X organization here, right? And then you kind of figure out, what does Railway have today, or what does your product have today that will actually make them happy? And then if they actually do or are necessarily really into your core value prop, then that's the sweet spot. Then you find your ICP. But the problem is that a lot of the ICP advice is kind of just out there, is kind of divorced from like the context of where it comes from, which is just like listening and investigative context, and not just like spraying and praying and like, oh, your early users, listen to them. There's a lot more nuance than that.
Like, I guess if you were selling to Google, there's probably like teams that will be much more nimble. And then like, if you're like, it's the very core of the business, like search, whatever, it's probably like completely different. But the team that does search, then like, you're probably going to make like infinitely more money doing that.
Yeah, I can't name names, but there's like some ironic companies that have signed up for Railway where they will like complain to us about the internal politics about even shipping stuff like internally, because said like moneymaker team has a lot of say over the platform resources, right? So like the rest of the business is kind of starved because, unfortunately, and this is like a weird quirk of the United States tax code, you can write off R&D expenses for software engineers, but you can't write off R&D expenses for DevOps engineers. So, yeah, I know, fun thing. And as partially as a result, actually, that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, why, like, I would say platform engineering resources are just so metered. The other thing is there's this like pervasive kind of view at a lot of companies that platform engineering is a cost center and not a value generator. So like, it's usually like, 1 to 2 people stuffed in a server closet who have to like deliver for the entire organization, and they're fighting fires all the time and their lives are absolutely miserable, right? And like, we have to be very careful to, whenever we sell Railway, that like our value prop is not to replace their jobs, right? Like, because there's a lot of companies out there who their marketing will be like, we want to kill and end DevOps. Like, first off, DevOps is a suite of practices, right, that you need to do to institute uptime, right? Where no one's killing DevOps anytime soon. With that said, in my opinion, no one is truly selling painkillers to those folks, right? So like, our goal, right, is to like not antagonize them, is actually to truly and properly serve them. With that said, right, and we talk, back to the whole ICP question that you mentioned, they talk rather differently to what the expectations of product engineer has, right? And unfortunately, because of the constraint of the resources of a lot of a modern engineering organization, again, there's a lot of, I would say, fair but unnecessary tension between, again, like a VP of infra and a VP of like, engineering, right? That have like two different goals. And sales is knowing to distinguish the difference between the two of them.
What's the actual reality of like selling into a cost center versus like a profit center from a sales perspective?
So there are different motions that a company can take when building out their funnel, if that makes sense. So like, if we're, I'm coming up with like a sector agnostic company, like I'm assuming any sort of size, right? Sometimes, depending on your value proposition as a company, very often there's like products out there that, I don't know, like the best way I can kind of describe it is like a FinOps company, right? That like promises like financial observability into like your infrastructure or your resources, right? Side, I'll put a pin on it. I think that's ridiculous, but that's a separate, right? But if I was trying to sell that, right, like usually my mindset is a very defensive mindset, right? Like, I have a concern about budget, right? And then that type of profile of who I would target, that's assuming that I didn't have like a lot of demand. I would like start reaching into what I would think are decision makers who do have control over the budget, right? Partially your VP of infra, but partially like your CFOs or your comptrollers at different these companies who are trying to look for space in areas that they don't have space before, right? So like, the way a CFO views the world is much different than like how a CIO or a CTO views the world. So if you are trying to sell, I would say defensive software, usually you're going to be trying to make your value prop much different that appeals to their world. Now, the difference of whether or not your software lands or not is, okay, the decision may be the CFO, but at the end of the day, the engineer has to use it, and that's the actual user I have to make happy. then you're going to have to kind of nuance your way, right, from that like top down sale, right? Some pieces of software, right, with like the value generation pieces of software, I would actually argue are sold bottom up, right? Because you have this kind of problem and you are kind of growing or expanding into this problem space. So you really want to be that tool set that you're kind of picked up at constantly, right? Whenever you're doing that, which is actually why I would argue like why Cursor has been, up here. Like I have no insight into like how they operate their business, but partially the reason why Cursor has been so successful is that like when you're reaching for a tool, they're kind of been the most like available to it, right? Whereas Copilot and like some people if I GitHub follow me, no offense, but like the interface to get to Copilot is VS Code, right? So if I'm like in this quote unquote like value generation mindset, there's this kind of like 2-door entryway for me to pick that tool, therefore preventing me from being top of mind whenever I make that decision or that value generation decision, right? So like whenever you're selling any sort of value or rather like a very positive go-to-market motion, it is of my opinion that you really should be kind of like going bottoms up rather than top down.
And the VS Code thing, you're saying that like if someone wants to use Copilot, they first have to use VS Code and then use Copilot, whereas Cursor is like, you hear about Cursor, you go get Cursor.
Yeah. And not only you hear about Cursor, but like they have, I think, done a pretty good job of like anchoring themselves to like the act of creation, right? So it's like, if you were to look at like productivity tools out there, like your Figmas or Cursors of the world, right? They're trying their best to, I would say shoehorn themselves right into like that bottoms up, heck, even Railway as well, right? Do Dev New and whatnot. Basically be like, here's this like palette or tool set that I have. Let me go make the thing. And then usually down the line, like those enterprise motions are kind of built after the fact because there's such like a groundswell of this user base. And then they kind of deal with the big company concerns after. Whereas like, again, cost center conversations, in my opinion, or rather just my observations, right, from seeing those products and even seeing how it's sold, it's very easy to go to like a big decision maker who is swinging a big giant axe, right, and say, hey, look, here's this bigger and shinier axe that you can use to free up budget, whereas, I don't know, I ask around, well, the line engineer is not necessarily doing cost cutting, right?
Yeah,
it's usually
that's what I was just thinking
down.
in my head. Like, I don't think it ever occurs to you, to cut costs. You don't. I mean, I just joined a startup Layer Code, and of course, I want to use their money wisely. But like,
Yeah.
I don't think about I just think, how do I do my job better? I don't care if a software costs $99 a month or $30 a month, or it's free, really, if it
Right.
does the job better.
Where you do care, right, is like, okay, and this kind of goes back into the whole, I think, like stuff we mentioned, a little bit at the beginning, right? Is that like software or rather a product can't embarrass you, right? Like you mentioned, I'll kind of turn, like you just joined this company. Would you feel comfortable asking for, leadership for software that costs $10,000 a month when you first joined?
It would have to be a pretty big,
right.
It's a high bar.
So for listeners, right, who are listening like on an audio only platform, right, like I don't want to embarrass Jack here, but like there was a facial reaction there, right? That is like,
probably a whole physical recoil.
Yeah,
it would be tough.
Right. So
I think you'd have to be selling really transformate. It's like it would have to be like a dev-in that is actually just gonna legitimately
crush, right?
Just crush. It's like a CTO basically. Yeah,
exactly, right. So like if you were to kind of like have a defensive product or rather a cost-cutting product be sold bottoms up, the way you would do it, and this is kind of where we're getting to like funny little psychology world, is like you need to make it so that the line engineer or the whatever motivations of the user makes them look really good to their boss, right? Like, hey, by using this thing, I have already freed up $20,000 of X spend, right? And again, they're not going to get promoted, right, as a result of doing that instantly. But any sort of tool or product that aligns the incentives of leadership and the line engineering core is a great tool for that, right? And that's like a good, interesting way to like, do a hypothesis. However, with that said, there's a reason why it's not done. And that's, again, what you kind of mentioned, right? Where, I think like there's like a lot of value prop to, the advantages of the world, but it's not like, and I'm pretty sure Ben might have a different view of what I have, but like, it's not like a line engineer is like clamoring to implement this thing bottoms up, right? It's usually like, hey, I have this like big world of machines that I need to have a handle on. I need to implement my view of the world, which is a world where I spend less on machines. Implement that for me. All right, pay 10K, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean. So bottoms up has an extra argument to it rather than just being...
Yeah, anyone who says PLG is dead has never done real PLG, is my argument. So, yeah.
Although I do feel
you
like...
can't... Yeah.
No, the one thing I will say is I feel like, I don't know, it's not anymore, but I was talking to someone about this today. I was like, that there was this like, especially a few years ago, there was this kind of cult of PLG, and especially like anti-sales PLG, where it was like sales, but it feels like now it's like a bit more like, you can have some sales, which is what we're going to get onto a little bit, which is like, if you have time, I want to ask you still about the automations that you've been doing.
It's been written to death on Beehive newsletters across the world, so I don't necessarily need to rehash this argument, but I think my final kind of note about, and this actually ties right into the automations, is that like for this like post-pandemic weird reality for like 2 years, people were just like giving stuff away for free and then being like, oh, that's my customer. Like I have to serve that customer. That's like, real sale. And it's like this entire like margin blind view of the world that makes entirely no sense. Right. Which is like how companies like just run headfirst into extinction. So I think that's like kind of like my big nuisance about, I would say like, oh, like the only way to defend the value of a product is to set up a bunch of these meetings, right? To justify the value of the product. To me is inane. So like, pulling out, right? People don't necessarily hate POG or people don't necessarily hate sales-led. What people genuinely hate is a sales experience that is so inane that you are just like so frustrated at the end of it that you don't even want to give them money, right? And there's a bunch of like, and it actually just ties right into the automation stuff. Like, okay, imagine, you're using Railway and like before we let you deploy, right? You have to like book a call with me, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm a wonderful person, right? But like you have better things to do, right? Than like look at my inane schedule, right? And just like figure out, my weird, right. And then you're gonna be so happy to use what I have. And then, okay, I'm gonna sweeten the deal. After the call that you have with me, I'm gonna go check in with you every day. I'm gonna go email you and be in your inbox and be like, hey, Jack, you are probably busy. Have you gotten on this thing? I would rather jump off a bridge. All right. And many developers would rather. So anyway,
I feel like, not to mention, I feel like you're also going to give me like a 1-month trial where I could try my deployment. And if I don't deploy, you're also going to email me and say, oh, would you like me to extend the trial to where you can try out the deployment?
And again, this is the whole same thing that like my gripe with like this like general advice misapplied at scale, ham-fisted, right? Like what developers dislike is that they dislike not being allowed to get their problem solved on their own and being trusted to do so. With that said, there is the problem is that with a lot of dev tools is that you can't live in a world where you're not defending the value of the product, right? Like there's this like world where a lot of engineers who, let's say, for example, use this open source tool. They have a genuinely custom use case. They spam the PR or issue things with their like very clearly, obviously corporate use case. That line that you skirt, right, between, what is like, I'm playing around and testing this versus like, no, this is actually ready for engineering prime time, is a very, very, very like precise line to walk. And this is actually reason why Railway has actually invested a lot in like, I would say, our sales automation pipelines, because we want people to like get as much value out of Railway as much as possible. But then what would happen inevitably right? Is that we'll have, Fortune 500 customer just like using it for prime time, and they would not tell us that it's for prime time. And then we would not mark their workload with the proper SLA. And then we would do something inevitably because we didn't know it was an actual real customer, and then knock it offline because we would migrate their workload because there's different SLAs, right? Like if you're trial and hobby, we move it around, right? Like that's how we get the margins. If you're pro and enterprise, we don't touch that workload, or we try our best not to touch that workload as much as possible. So there have been times where I would get a very angry email to our joint, or shared inbox being like, "You fools, this thing is so important. Why did you touch this? Don't you?" And this is like we would get this hundreds of times at the time before we had to actually implement this. So then we were like, look, all of these sales like outreach stuff that I would do for customers who would sign up with like a corporate email are not working, right? They just fundamentally don't work. And then, I went through this like moment of walking in the desert, and it's really hard to take it not personally, right? Whenever no one answers your sales outreach email, it's like, is there something wrong with me? Right? You start thinking a bunch of wacky, crazy stuff. But no, when
Am
we
I
actually
bad
really
at
thought
writing
about
emails?
yeah, you're right. No, it's exactly that. There was some pretty passive aggressive copy that I did not ship that I was like,
That's what matters.
Right, but
Yeah.
And by the way, I try my best to respond to everyone that by the way, like when you do see it from Railway, right, it is from the team properly. Anyways, tying it back together, we learned right through the whole product-led growth process is that what we need to do is that any sort of, I would say, corporate or support use case, we need to make that door as open as possible so we can allow the graceful kind of like up leveling of a customer from, let's say, like $100 to $1,000 to $10,000, if that makes sense. And the tradition, if we applied the traditional advice onto Railway or to most other companies, is to start gating the product, is to start demo gating a bunch of these different features, and then you have to start like protecting again these quote unquote more valuable areas of the product. The insight that we saw is that look, like we're gonna hand these SKUs to you. We want you, we trust you to like charge yourself. And there's also a bunch of other macro factors that have made this possible. Right, 10 years ago, it was very rare for line employees to have a corporate spend card. Now Brexes and ramps are, prevalent everywhere. That was also another like innovation that we've been able to take advantage of. But even outside of that, by keeping the door open, right, we've later found that, large companies are more than willing to talk to us and be happy to talk to us since we've made that process as easy as possible. So that, again, I'm going to put a little bow on it. We've now made it so that, if you are, if I detect that you're part of a Fortune 500 company and I detect a bunch of customers who are onto the platform, I'm just going to start sending Slack invites on day 0, right? And we're trying to create the surface area of conversation to really kind of, pull out any sort of concerns ahead of time so we're not on the back foot. Because the problem is that if you're on the back foot, that pressure goes to the support organization, not your sales team. And that is a much harder sales conversation to have when they're dealing with an outage, which is nigh impossible, versus you kind of rolling out the red carpet and making sure that they feel heard and their concerns are properly addressed.
So and just playing that back to make sure people get this, because I feel like this is just gold. So it's like, like usually like a platform might say, okay, this feature, let's say like, I'm just making something up, but like, say you want a static IP on this resource. It's like only enterprise customers can have this. And you have to like call us up if you want to do this. You're just going to like, that's exposed. Like you can do anything in Railway. But the downside of that is that you're not necessarily knowing if someone's like an enterprise use case or not. But what you're doing is like, you're letting them do anything, but then you're also making it very easy to get in touch with you and doing some automation so that you could maybe figure out from like their domain and stuff that they are enterprise customer and that you should get them on the right plan and get them on the appropriate SLAs and all that sort of stuff and build them properly. And
yeah, I know you were making up a use case, right? But that's actually a very accurate use case, right? Like whenever anyone presses the static IP button on Railway, the sales organization at Railway gets a webhook, and it gets put into ADIO and says, we need to start talking to this person. This looks legitimate.
it's fun. I think I pull that out because I think Vanta, I went through like we had to go through SOC 2 compliance, and like Vanta, one of the things they flag and like I think we're using DigitalOcean was like it has to be like static IP, and so maybe that's why.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's exactly that, right? Like another, so the other thing that we, I think we're quite open and honest about is that like, if you use certain features, we call them, no offense to our Canadians out there, but we call them Canadian limits, right? We'll just let you use it, but like, we'll like, as soon as you kind of cross different thresholds or different shapes of what we kind of seen through a bunch of heuristics of like what looks like legitimate use cases, then we start putting you on the email drip, right? And then like this is on the blog post I think I've written and put this in the show notes, is that like regular cold outreach emails, we were getting like a 0.017 response rate, like something abysmal. By the way, industry standard is like 0.3. So like, if we were spraying and praying emails, it was like horrible, right? But like we found that these targeted emails, right, depending on the different feature use cases, like, again, I don't have the Hex dashboard up and running, but like, I can tell you probably it's like response rates are usually at like 3 to 4%, which are actually very good when it comes to like, pulling out those concerns from those customers. And then because Railway is a consumption-based business, right, the way we kind of structure the, a deal, quote unquote, like to get to committed spend, that's what we kind of consider success on our side, is, okay, what are all the different workloads that you have either on Railway or off Railway that we have to bring to you to bring to the platform for you to feel like you want to like really get a proper SLA or really feel like you need to support SLO, that type of stuff. And then those conversations take 6 months. And I think one of the moments of arrogance that I had, and I'm willing to put this on the podcast, is like, I thought we can like turn that 6 month sales process to 1 month. Like, when I first started getting in the job, I was like, look, the same thing that we did to deployments, we can do for sales. Like we can make people, like we can make people sign contracts as soon as they sign up. Wrong. There's a bunch of, I would say, like out of product concerns that I think Railway had to kind of grow up now that we've kind of finally hit that. Now we can kind of empower engineers or engineering teams to kind of go to, their security organization and be like, look, we do all the right stuff here. The other thing as well, since I'm kind of already rambling, right, is like, moving into our own data centers as well, right? A lot of people think that was like a great move and it paid off. We're recording this, I think, the day after the AWS unfortunate outage and how GOP's all affected. But, when we first did that migration, a lot of our Fortune 500 customer segment was raising their eyebrow at us and being like, you what? Like we liked the fact that you're on GCP. That was a bunch of guarantees that we got by virtue of that. So there was a bunch of other additional resources that we had to do to even, do the traditional sales cycle. And that's a one that I'm happy to talk about as well.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I feel like we could, I don't want to keep you on this because I feel like.
No, I'm it's such a big topic. Just like being able to explore all the stuff.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting maybe to do like a whole episode on like the business of like, your own data centers. I mean, that was like, we did talk about that on the episode with Jake. But I think
there's another person who probably can speak more authentically to it, who is, as we speak right now in Equinix, just sweating, or freezing. Like,
yeah, that'll be great.
Yeah. If he was to take the call or the podcast from the data center, right, you just hear fans. It's just like,
nice. Oh yeah, I should just go there. It'll be like cool background. Actually, but last closing thing is I think that we use Slack Connect, and I think now that this is not, I feel like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this was like a kind of thing that people were like, hey, you should use, everyone knows Slack Connect's really good, I feel like now. But the automation part of it was like quite interesting. I think people should see your blog post about how you did it. And like, I think like you've just written in a lot of detail how you built this whole like custom automation there. I don't know if you want to just give like a very like high level overview of what you did, and you'd still recommend people doing this.
Well, thankfully now there's vendors, I think, who finally caught up. I think the problem,
okay.
So the problem Railway has is that we keep running into issues before other vendors or our competitors running into those issues, which I guess is a blessing in disguise. So for example, like one of the weird pathologies that we have, right, is like we want to talk to every user, right? As much as possible because, I used to work for this like really sleepy enterprise company called Citrix. And I remember back when I was a PM, I would email people and no one would reply to me, hence spilling like triggering the whole existential like wandering the desert phase, right? Like what's wrong with me? And by the way, these are people who pay like 6-7 figures like about on software, just for the record. Like they're paying you a lot of money and then you reach out to them and they don't want to talk to you, which is like insane to me, right? So that aside, so like when I left product management for reasons and became a support engineer, the first concern that we had was like, okay, like how can we talk to all of our users as much as possible? So we built a bunch of like Discord bot automations that, for example, if we launched a beta feature, we will like tag the beta flight group and, it kind of turns into like a Twitch chat whenever we launch a feature. It's actually kind of really energizing for our engineers because it's like they're playing to a crowd. So that was kind of how that started. And then when we started moving towards more upmarket customers, and I think I tweeted about this before, but we've had like a major travel company CTO in our Discord being like, "Hey guys, how do I get a demo?"
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then I was just embarrassed. So I think that was kind of when we realized, okay, we needed to actually start changing the channel that we're having discussions on. Now, I wanted to put this in the blog post, but my editor took it out. But I think he deserves his plaudits. Like the Slack Connect stuff, arguably was pioneered by Michael Grinich, at WorkOS. Shout out. So
Shut up. Sponsoring this game.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was not intended, but but just want to put this out there. It was really from him, right? So I don't know how they did it, but I think it was manual on their. I don't know. I'm you have to get the story from him, but I remember when I signed up, he invited me to a Slack Connect channel like almost instantly and started working me. Right now, with that said, I'm not the decision maker, right? So I couldn't implement it, right? So I just want to But long story short is we like, I would say from a intent perspective, right, had a very similar philosophy because like in Discord back when we were using it, we would even have private channels with our customers then. So we were just kind of transposing that concept into a separate channel. But the issue is that at the time we were using a support vendor that I think was pivoting its core value proposition because their first initial proposition was like, we're going to be an API first support system. And I think their customer base was like, look, we're not using a support vendor for us to rebuild our own support tool. Just give a support tool. And the issue that we had was we needed to be able to kind of conditionally like spin up channels up and down depending on their customer relationship with us. And we had like two different kind of warehouses of data between our source of truth of like what the railway customers actually were versus like if a customer was, I think, facing an issue. And I think at the time, I'm not sure, I don't want to misrepresent their product roadmap, we couldn't ad hoc spin up channels for those customers. So what ended up happening is I would have to spin up the channel manually in Slack, add the bot, and then, even if they would join, which is a whole separate issue. So at Railway, we have this kind of philosophy about support engineering and rather like what we call logistics engineering, where like we treat non-product interactions like sales, like support as its own product with its own roadmap because we want it to be considered. Like I make this joke all the time to my friends. If I want us to be like, how people are like, oh, we're like the cursor for X. Like I want to be known as the Chick-fil-A of infrastructure, right? I want us to be known of like having the best service with a smile and like a damn good sandwich or a damn good server, right?
Okay.
So
can we have a Chick-fil-A is like, we don't have it. So what's the?
Sorry.
Is
Yeah,
there
yeah,
like,
sorry. Yeah.
Is there
Yeah,
like
Chick-fil-A,
McDonald's? Is that no? It's
no. It's like a premium.
No.
Okay, so
Okay.
for your non-US listeners, Chick-fil-A is a sandwich chain usually known in the American South that is known for its like Southern hospitality. Right.
Okay.
So like when you go to a Chick-fil-A restaurant, they have like and I'm not kidding. They have operations researchers on staff that learn how to like maximally queue people for the best experience possible. So like when you're in a queue, and if it's like too long, they will just have the person take your order while in line, so that when you are at the counter, you actually just pick up your order. Chick-fil-A is also known for its like, what is it? Distributed Kubernetes DevOps organization. Like they will run Kubernetes like pods and clusters like per restaurant. There's like a whole talk about it. You can put it in show notes.
Really?
Yeah. So it's a sandwich chain with I'm just kidding. Not with software margins, but like it's a company that is like just absolutely dedicated to delivering a good sandwich at a semi-reasonable price, like slightly above, but just it's one of those like remarkable experiences where not only the sandwich, but the whole process of even getting your sandwich is considered. For me, right, this like, and again, I have like some wacky cuckoo ideas, right? Like when I joined Railway, I wanted to kind of allow us to put this practice of like hospitality. And luckily I have a boss that kind of supports that. And the way we kind of process our whole sales process is part of that, right? So that's the reason why we put a lot of engineering time. So when we were trying out different support vendors for the Slack experience, and we couldn't get it the way that we wanted to, that was the reason why we went off and built the system ourselves. So that's like a lot of context of like why we're kind of proud of this.
And it seems like you can I haven't actually had to do it, I think, in Railway. But by the way, like a side point, I have used it. I am actually a paying customer. I got an invoice today. Yeah, it's great. Anyway, I probably should have said this earlier than like 1 hour into the episode. But anyway, better late than never. It's like when you do a support message, you can like select the resource and stuff like that as well, right? Like that seems like super nice.
Right. And that came out of our frustration with Zendesk, right? Like we were like, when I was in support, like I remember maybe they changed it. I'm not sure. I remember like responding to customers and pressing Zendesk and like waiting 5 seconds for like the state of the front end to change. And again, like I have like this weird DHH like impatience of like for like shit software. You might have to blip that. I'm sorry. But like, yeah, so like this whole experience was like so frustrating where like my colleague Ray and I were like, how hard is it to build our own, support? Like how, like how really like difficult is this really? And it took a lot of like, think like internal justification. To be fair, I was also partially skeptical. But like we were churning through 2 support vendors. We were not going to go try a third. We're at that point, we're just kind of exasperated and we just kind of built it ourselves. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, like if anyone has any issues, you can click on the resource that you're having a problem with. And then the admin on the Railway side, the support person on the Railway side has all the context. So we're not going back and forth, oh, what's my invoice number? Oh, what's this? Oh, what's, it saves us massive time where, I'm not sure if we can publish those numbers just yet, but we can process like a lot of tickets with minimal support resources where our customers don't necessarily feel that, it's just 1 or 2 people behind this screen, if that makes sense. It just feels that expansive. And that's what leverage is.
The scale that you guys are at, just because for people, you've got 2 people on support and there's like 26 people or something at Railway.
Yeah, so we're at 27 people. We have a support engineering team of 4. And then now we're starting to expand proper CSEs, like customer support engineers. But yeah, we only have 2 people on support rotation every week, like an L1 and an L2. And, they get paged, they hold a pager. I think there's like a blog post probably to be written about like how we structure, I would say like, paging and operations and whatnot. But like if a really expensive enterprise customer needs to wake up the support L1, they hold the pager duty like just like anyone else, and then they do the escalation and the priority comms from there. With that said, we're now at the point where we have like we're just now starting to cross the Rubicon of like actually starting to have like full-time, I would say like success folks just for that whole customer segment, because I think and not to toot our own horn, but like we've just had like a massive expansion in terms of like committed, I would say, contracts on the platform, and then we're now starting to run into the whole, we kind of alluded to at the start of this conversation, what does the market kind of expect, which is like this idea of like a dedicated account resource versus this like floating account resources that we were able to kind of get by with like the last 5 years.
They want to see the same person every time.
Yeah, or at least like the same group of people. Like the problem right now that we're running into is like if you have a really long running account and a long running ask and you're kind of passing on the baton to different support resources, it's like we can do all the AI summarizations as much as you want. It's not the same as having one person really understanding that account.
It just feels weird.
Yeah.
Doesn't feel like Chick-fil-A. They wouldn't do that, right?
They would not, probably not, but I'm pretty sure they have shifts in staffing. Yeah, well, maybe, I don't know. the idea is that like you have a standard of excellence so high, right? It doesn't matter who's behind the chair, if that makes sense, right?
Okay.
Like the problem that most companies have is that, and this is like whole separate with my obsession about football, which I know is not cool for British technical folks, but like as an American, it's cool and like interesting.
I have no idea.
Yeah, right. So like it shouldn't matter. Like the identity of a team should be imprinted where it doesn't necessarily matter who's on the field. Everyone knows how to play that way, and then you're not having to deal with like having to rely on your superstars, if that makes sense. Which is a whole separate, I would say, like engineering and organizational psychology thing, which is part of one of my unfortunately many. And
you're saying like you want to keep, if everyone's good, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but not I would say like a little bit reductive, because like every company, like if you ever ask a company, like, do you hire the best people? Of course they're like, yes, of course, right? It's one of those like ice cream questions.
Either if they would believe they hire the best people, or if they don't believe it, why would they say they don't?
Yeah, right.
There's
like no companies out there being like, we hire the worst, right? And we're proud. Like that's just not a sentence that people say.
Reasonable people, but like,
we'll take whatever we can get.
Yeah.
But on that note, right? Like I'm not necessarily the type of person who is like, I don't know, so psychopathic where it's like, I only work with A players and, screw B players. I think an ideal organization, whenever you build any sort of company or any sort of org, is you have a standard, right? And you're very clear about that standard up front, right? And not like this, like in a weird 996 way where like, oh, we work a lot of hours. But like the one thing that Railway looks for is we look for a standard of care into whatever this person does, right? And there's a battery of questions that we have that try to suss that out from the person, whoever is in any sort of interview process, such that any sort of problem that you give them, because they care and because they have, reasonable work ethic, they're going to be able to like give you above average, if not excellent results in what they do. Right. Whereas like a lot of, I would say, hiring practices out there are kind of like weirdly, like just signal gathering for like signifiers of status, or just like, oh, you were at big company here and like you moved random numbers, so that means you must be good. But then like you actually work with them and like actually talk with them, it doesn't really line up, right? Like, there's a lot of, again, I'm probably getting myself in trouble with this. There's a lot of like big company executives out there, right? Who like with a straight face take credit for like, 3 times revenue growth. And then like you really dig in with their actual accomplishments, and it's like, you didn't actually do that, right? So like I would much rather work with someone who is like slightly insane, kind, right? Like, you can't be weird and you can't be and rude at the same time. But someone
yeah, that's true.
There's a budget, right? But like, again, I would argue that anyone at Railway, or really anyone who wants to build a high performance organization, I think has those traits where it's like, there's this kind of like team identity that, again, if you were to swap maybe one person or 2 people out, and assuming it's like a group of 8 people, the new hires that do join are able to kind of intuit explicitly and implicitly from the standards of the culture of that organization, and they're able to kind of show up. Which again is a whole other sales issue as well, because a lot of sales organizations usually are kind of built in this like churn and burn fashion, which I think is a a very big gripe I have with the sales industry, or rather the sales profession.
That's true. Yeah.
Oh, you didn't hit your quota. Bye. It's just like what yeah, it's a weird dynamic. I don't necessarily think like they do this out of like this like masochistic desire to just like fire people, right? In a perfect world, your sales organization is on fire and just like ripping through without any issues, right? And of course, there's going to be like some management issues, as it is with any sort of role. I think the issue is that when Railway was faced with that exact same kind of juncture point, right, where a lot of the advice that we were getting was, hey, look, it's time to start, maybe not jump into territory managers, right, because that would be like, I don't know, a way overkill from where we were at. But there was kind of this idea that like you can kind of do this like paint by numbers support thing, and you can just like paint by numbers sales process. For us, we were just basically kind of intuiting like, look, what can we do to make the purchasing process as automatic as possible, such that the sales experience is an enjoyable process from start to finish, which requires like a radical reimagining of like how a sales organization is done.
It's not optimized for revenue, it's optimized for experience.
Oh, don't get me wrong, it is optimized for revenue, but yeah. I guess the thing is, like, if you give someone a really good experience, right? Again, the shut up and take my money aspect of it is automatic, not necessarily you have to like induce it into your customer.
Yeah, I guess it's just like a different stage of like optimization, in that you're optimizing the bigger picture rather than like just the immediate like revenue generation. Angelo, we're getting dangerously close into like longest episode ever territory. Which I think Adam Frankel is currently the holder of.
Yeah, your editor is going to need a lot of help.
I have really enjoyed this. I think people won't know this, but we've been like kind of DM buddies for ages, but never actually met, and this has been incredible. I could ask you stuff all day, and I think would love to have you back on again. Getting premature here, but thank you so much. That was brilliant.
Thank you, Jack, and it's a pleasure to be here. And hopefully, your listeners get value out of this conversation.
And by the way, do you have any like shout outs that you want to direct people to? Railway.com.
Oh man, yeah, if you have code that you would like live, Railway.com is there. But also, I think, yeah, I think it's probably my first and only shout out. And then I think I have like a few, books of note. If anyone wants to kind of like read the literature, I think behind this stuff, I think it's a fascinating world. If you want to dive into, I can pass those links on to your listeners.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. We'll fill out the show notes. I think there's a lot of stuff. Thank you, Angelo. Really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for listening. If you made it this far, send us a message. Let us know.